Welcome to the Crypto Compliance Podcast by Gatenuts.
Pawel Kuskowski, welcoming Crypto Compliance by Gatenuts, where compliance experts and practitioners are talking about current market events and general compliance aspects. We are doing this to promote compliance in crypto, bring in interesting topics and top speakers. I would like to ask you to like our podcast, to share it, to comment it, and to subscribe to our channel. Let's together promote compliance culture in crypto and Web 3.0. Today, my guest is Amanda Wick. Amanda is a founder and chief executive officer of Women in Crypto. She is a former chief of legal affairs at Chainalysis, blockchain analytics company, senior policy advisor at the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, FinCEN, a former federal prosecutor. Amanda is in crypto since 2013. During our conversation, we talk about the size of money laundering in crypto, the tools available to analyze this risk, and that these tools are effectively much better than in traditional finance. We were talking about the crypto ecosystem and the risk related to this. And the exchanges, some of the exchanges are notorious in money laundering, and the ecosystem knows this. DeFi, decentralized finance, the centralized ecosystem is becoming a problem from the regulatory perspective, a problem from the compliance perspective. That some of the companies try to do good and try to talk with the regulators, but failed. We spoke about geopolitics at play and how the US government being reactive to the changes and maybe losing the war on innovation, and that it's becoming too expensive to break things from the crypto perspective. So watch our episode, like it, share it, subscribe it. Thank you. Hi, Amanda. I'm very excited to have you on our podcast. Definitely want to hear from you about what's happening at the moment in the US and globally in the world. But why don't we start with your latest Women in Crypto initiative and how you transitioned from what you've done for the government and for private sector, and how you transitioned into Women in Crypto?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. So I spent about a decade in the federal government as a prosecutor, and there were a lot of us that were in crypto, investigators, prosecutors. If you looked around in the US government, there were a ton of women in crypto. When I left in 2020 and went to Chainalysis to be their chief of legal affairs, I saw a very different side of crypto in the private sector. And you would have thought from the industry that there were no women in crypto or blockchain. And the treatment of women by the industry was so different. And I said, this is wildly bad. And I talked with some folks at Chainalysis who were really supportive. And we started a speaker series called Women in Crypto, where we just profiled women in the industry and then had these networking events afterwards. And women from all over the world were coming to these networking events, and it was amazing. And so I realized there's a community there that was looking for something. And so I went back to the government unexpectedly for a year. But while I was there, I was building this nonprofit and then launched it October of last year. And we've been having events globally and bringing together women and male allies to fight for a greater inclusion of women in the space.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I saw your post recently that, the people who are asking right questions from the beginning in crypto were women. And I completely agree. And I saw this from the beginning, and then women disappeared. So I completely support, what you're saying. Another interesting topic, which I think, we both shared some view on, is the size of money laundering in crypto, right?
Yeah.
And I know that you spent some time in Chainalysis. I built CoinFin, which is, another blockchain analytics company. And I think, what we hear on the market is slightly different what at least I believe is reality, which means that the size of money laundering in crypto is far higher than what we hear, right? And we had discussion before, but is it 0.2 or what's the size you mentioned?
Yeah, I think different blockchain analytics companies put it at different numbers. I think I saw a panel yesterday where somebody was on that said that one of the recent numbers that a blockchain analytics company put out was 0.25%, I think. It had gotten that low. When I was at Chainalysis, I believe the number was either 1% or 2%. And it used to be at 2%. It dropped. I think part of the problem that I have with that number, or I should say, and this is an important distinction, the problem that I have is kind of how that number is explained. And oftentimes it's a marketing tool. And part of the problem is that you have, I don't want to say two factions, but you've got government investigators, right? Or people who are in AML compliance who are looking for what is like the risk, in this industry? Like how much illicit money do we think is in this industry, which for crypto has been a perception problem, even if it hasn't been a real problem for a very long time. And so the way that we talk about that number tends to lack nuance and explanation, because a lot of times marketing just loves to do a soundbite, right? And everybody loves to run around and say, oh, the illicit use in crypto is down to 1%, it's down to 0.5%, it's down to 0.25%. But understanding what that number actually is and where it's coming from is super important for folks like us, because as you know, the numerator, right, is their attempt to capture all of the actual illicit funds. And the denominator is this number that's supposed to capture all of the activity in crypto. And as you can imagine, there's problems in both of those numbers, right? Like the numerator is oftentimes only on-chain data, which then depends on the blockchain analytics company that's analyzing it. It also omits a lot of data that they don't have. They haven't mapped all the blockchain. They're not using off-chain data. So folks that are doing compliance, and especially folks that are in government investigations that have access to tons of off-chain data, know that that number is a low estimate. It's a floor, right? And then on the denominator side, you've got this number that's, this is all the activity in crypto. But we know that some of that activity could be wash trading. It could be, even that number is like a ceiling, right? So somewhere in between there's a range. And I know we talked about this before, but I don't think this number is done well for traditional finance. I think people do their best guess estimates at this, which is why when people run around saying like, this is the number, I'm like, please put some caveats. And that's the lawyer in me. Like I don't do lawyering as much now, but the lawyer in me, right? It's like, please just put like an asterisk or an explanation, because people latch on to sound bites. And the next thing you know, everyone's running around saying the percentage of illicit use in crypto is this teeny, teeny, tiny number. And I'm like, don't do that. Don't do it. Because then, the other thing that makes it really hard to do is have people who are in government agencies around the world go to their supervisors, go to their agency leads, go to their regulators and say, hey, the numerator of this has been rising year over year and over year. In fact, in some cases, that numerator has doubled year over year. We need more resources. We need more training. And then, what inevitably happens? Somebody holds up a little marketing piece that says, but the illicit use in crypto is only 0.25%. And I've got all kinds of other threats that I have to fund for. So why should I put resources towards this? So it creates a lot of problems. And I understand why they do it, and they're trying to do their best. It's just that number. And the folks in data who talk about this, they do try to explain it. It's just that when it makes its way through marketing and into materials and into sound bites, that's when we have real big problems.
I agree, but at the same time, I think overstating or understating the size of the problem is not going to help anyone in the industry. I don't think like anyone who is in who knows money laundering, AML reporting, all this stuff, would accept this tiny amount which is involved in money laundering, right? Even I don't think right. It's even counting the size of tax evasion. If we add tax evasion to this, it's going to be like because there's so many jurisdictions which either don't have proper tax setup or they didn't have, right?
Yeah, so. But again, I go back to fairness, right? Like I really, because we should be tech equal. I mean, at most tech equal, at least tech neutral, right? And anybody who's sitting here saying that the amount calculated for tax evasion in traditional finance, right? When there's so many ways to evade taxes, there's just a ruling that came out the other day that's going to make it easier for for wealthy Americans to evade taxes in foreign jurisdictions. Like the idea that we're somehow tracking this super well in traditional finance, I also think is a little bit of a lie that we've told ourselves, because we are tracking it. This idea that there's a exact number and we are just trying to get to it. We're trying to do our best guess of what the risk is, right? It's just like a risk-based approach in compliance. There's not an exact number of what that risk-based assessment is. You do your best to try to look at the risk, assess the risk accurately, and get as close to that number as you can, which is why I think it's good that these blockchain analytics tools put out the number. It's just that you have to explain that it's a range. You have to explain, like, we're doing our best guess, but we don't have off-chain data. Like, you have to explain why that number is a best guess, why it's an estimate, and understand that at best it's a floor and it is almost certainly above that. Now, the question, how far above that? I really do think that when people say that there's no evidence that it's more than traditional finance, I agree with them. Traditional finance historically, and I know there are people who even dispute this number, but a lot of times we use 5%. I don't know where that number, I think it was like from a UN report. Do you remember where this? What's your number that you use for like the illicit amount in traditional finance?
3 to 5%. That's all the estimates, and I think this is correlating. And it's funny, there is a story on this. I mean, I spent several years in compliance and AML in banking sector, right? And we used to have this number, 3 to 5% in terms of high risk clients, right? Which you typically wouldn't deal with even, right? And that's kind of very similar number to what we have in terms of money laundering, right? In all the reports. And at the same time, I remember, first when we start with CoinFirm, we've done very similar transaction monitoring model as you would have in traditional finance, and you run this model on crypto, and surprise, what the number came up as? The size 3 to 5%. Yeah, 3 to 5% exactly. So, and I think this is more or less what we should accept. This is kind of Pareto principle, all the stuff which you have. So anyone who is saying, oh, it's much higher or much lower, I think we need to get very detailed explanation. Otherwise, it's counter let's say intuitive.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that crypto has a marketing and messaging problem / mission right now, right? So crypto's been under attack since it was invented. I was one of the people who attacked it. That's why I say that. When I was a prosecutor back in like 2013, we would tell jurors, this is just criminal money. The only people who use this are criminals, right? And then, the crypto pizza and overstock and all this stuff happened. Then we actually started using it and seeing the potential for the technology. And the truth is, criminals are always first adopters of technology. The vehicle, the automobile, would not have succeeded without bank robbers investing in cars that were faster than horses, right? So every technology originates from that. The issue is, to your point, at best, it's the same, right? You've created an alternative form of finance. There's no reason to think that it's not going to end up having the same amount of money laundering. Now, I personally feel, because I saw this on the criminal side, there was some adoption by criminals very quickly, right? Ransomware, cyber criminals, folks who already understood tech. It was a very easy transition for them to move to tech money, right? Yeah. But your drug dealers, your cartels, like things, that's been not. There were some things that I was worried would boom. Why wouldn't that go into DeFi immediately? And the truth is there is just as much of a tech barrier for some OG criminals as there is for the people in your life who are like, I just don't understand this. How does the software have any value, right? Like, there are old cartel members that were literally on wiretap saying the same thing, right? So you kind of have to be realistic about these numbers and then the reality of humans, right? And even some human criminals are slow to adapt to change. They don't like technology, right? If it's too technical, they're not going to do it either. And the reality is whether it was traditional or finance or money laundering, whether it was traditional finance or crypto, we always used to say we only catch the dumb ones anyways. Right? So there was that problem. But to your original point, here's the thing that gets me. The discussion about the amount of crypto and money laundering, I feel like is a little bit of a, what's that term for like something that gets you to focus here, but a red herring. It's a little bit of a red herring because everybody wants to jump on this and worry about which one's more, traditional finance or crypto. When what we really should be talking about is how do you detect it? It's very easy comparatively to look at funds that are transferred on a open viewable blockchain. I'm not talking about privacy coins. Let's carve those out, right? But on an open viewable blockchain, my ability to see the direct or indirect exposure to illicit funds, I think, is much easier than a traditional financial institution's ability to go back hops in the process. In the United States, they have to use 314B. In other jurisdictions, I know, like I've talked with other folks that say 314B is largely non-existent in some foreign countries. So when you get to foreign countries and correspondent banking, now it's even harder to find out where the money's coming from, source of funds, likelihood that it's illicit. So when I talk with folks in compliance who've transitioned from traditional finance to crypto, they're so floored at the visibility. And those are some of the biggest proponents of crypto are people who are in a transaction monitoring tool on the crypto side versus what did transaction monitoring look like in the black box that was banks and that bank to bank issue or a source of funds from outside of a bank. How do you know where it comes from? Comparatively to crypto, when you have funds that are marked where you can see they're coming from illicit sources, and it's not obviously all marked, but there's a huge visibility advantage, I think, that crypto has in transaction monitoring that we don't spend enough time talking about, which I think is a process advantage that's more important than just percentage points to percentage points, who's got the most dirty money. It's like, let's get off of that because I don't know that either of those numbers are accurate. But let's talk about the process because what crypto can do in compliance in terms of giving an entity a reliable direct and indirect exposure assessment, I think is huge, is massively important.
No, totally, and I think, partially this is why I started CoinFim, to show the difference between, what you can do in traditional banking. And I was trying to get my hands on Swift data, which was very, very difficult, to do the same exactly analytics. So that's something which I completely agree. And, it brings so much transparency into the entire process. I think, over time, if we want to, and that's actually, very interesting transition to my next question, which is, the exchanges and different jurisdictions, right? And the risk of some, because, if we get this part right and add to this, the blockchain analytics aspect, then we have really, really interesting setup, and which is gonna be very difficult to for them. So it's something which I think is. So what's your view about the ecosystem? Like we hear about Binance, Binance, I think it's a villain at the moment, which everyone, especially US side of the world, let's say, is trying to catch. And we know, I think, we need to agree that there's some merit in this.
I will say I always worry because when I started the association, I started traveling internationally even more than I used to. And I always really worry because I feel like most Americans don't realize how bad their news is here. Like how bad the information that how limited it is. Like when you get outside of the United States and you start watching core news, and God, even CNN Global versus CNN US is so wildly different that when I come back to the United States, I'm always afraid that I've entered this like curtain of crap news. I'm legitimately, you have to do so much of your own research on what you're hearing just because of like the factual accuracy of it and the clickbait, titles versus what's in them. but how much is actually making it in, right? Because there are exchanges out there that are just solely criminal enterprises, right? Like we saw a couple of years ago something called the development of exchange as a service. And these were just exchanges in a box that you could purchase that were just money laundering vehicles. No attempt, like no AML, no KYC. If you were a criminal, you could literally buy a crypto exchange in a box, set it up, and then usually they would run as like a nested service on some of these larger exchanges, right, for their liquidity. Some of the exchanges were good at detecting those nested services. Some of them took a little bit longer to set up a program to do that. Some of them never did it, right? Or maybe they're not being honest about whether they're doing it well or not. But to your point, one of my frustrations is that the blockchain analytics tools companies for years have been putting out data. These are the 5 dirtiest exchanges. These are the 5, these are the X number of exchanges that are touching illicit activity. And what people don't, I think, realize about that is, can you imagine in our past lives if it was that easy to just see that HSBC had been touching? Like, we don't have to spend several years on a big investigation trying to find. We can just literally cream skim and look at the illicit finance flows and see who's touching tons of dirty money and say, this looks like it's an insufficient AML program. We're just going to ask you for some paperwork because we can actually see where you fall month to month to month, even taking into account volume. We can see who falls where on the illicit funds. You are consistently in that top 3, right, illicit funds bucket. There's a real good chance that your AML program is not developing consistently with your risk appetite.
But you know what's the typical answer is? Oh, but we are getting these funds, but we report them, and that's something which is interesting as an answer. So suspicious activity reports, all this stuff, and it's very difficult to challenge this, because we don't know what they do effectively.
Well, I believe that, and don't quote me on this, but I'm because my memory is especially on cold meds, it's notoriously bad. But I feel like in one of the recent public complaints that was against a major exchange, it said something like they hadn't filed a suspicious activity report in X number of years. I think not, maybe since, I can't remember what the year was, 2020 or something.
Yeah.
But usually, to your point, the government is the one that discloses, right, which STRs or SARs have been filed, or what the lack of compliance is, which is one of the reasons why it's very difficult, because these blockchain analytics companies are sitting kind of looking at this data from the outside. The government hopefully is using those tools and is looking at its own data and that on-chain analytical data, and is drawing its own conclusions and is hopefully going in and examining. I will say one of the biggest problems that I've heard globally, but especially in the US, is that governments were not ready for the explosion of crypto, and they waited way too long to get subject matter experts and people who could do these examinations and people who could do enforcement. So you had a lag where whether it's a bank integrity unit, whatever part of an FIU, whoever's responsible for and in some of these countries, by the way, there is no agency. They don't even yet have an agency or a plan for monitoring. I've talked with some friends who are investigators in Africa and also countries around the world, but they were specifically like, we don't even have a designation of authority to be able to examine these exchanges, to be able to compel them, which then is a problem, because if there's no examination and if there's no ensuring that they have sufficient AML programs, then when law enforcement from around the world comes to them and says, hey, we have a subpoena, we're doing the process, we're doing it correctly, there's nobody to enforce when that exchange says, we're not cooperating with law enforcement, or we have this ridiculous requirement we want you to meet before we'll legally comply with a subpoena. Like these are things that are very problematic, right? If you don't have a jurisdiction like the United States, like the UK, like that have these frameworks for, you are required to have this, and this to have a sufficient AML program. And cooperating with law enforcement and responding to legal orders is generally considered a pretty important part of programming. So to your point earlier, I will say there are companies, it was called Crypto Compare, and now I forget, I think it went under a name change. But one of the things that I think folks in industry have been, I've heard this from multiple people. This is not just like a personal view, but when you have blockchain analytics companies that sell tools to, and this is several of them. This is not just one of them. But when you have companies that sell tools to both exchanges and government agencies and private sector, right? When they are selling products to everything, there's a little bit of a concern of, well, the incentive structure there is not necessarily to be honest about all parts of the sector, right? And if you're selling tools to a bunch of exchanges, how honest are you being about that sector of the industry? Are you really airing all of their dirty laundry? Or are you a little afraid that if you're really honest about them, they'll stop buying your product? And this is like I said, this is a structural problem, which is why I think you see some companies like Crypto Compare, or I forget what its new name is, but and I think there's several of them. I don't think Crypto Compare is the only one, but some of these companies that are out there that are like, hey, we are trying to be an objective, honest broker of what is the risk of these exchanges. We don't sell to them. We don't care if they're upset with us. Yeah. We don't and I think there was a space in the market there that people were like, we really want objective data about what is the risk of these exchanges. And I think you'll see an increase there because, as we get closer, especially in the United States, to having any kind of regulatory structure, which is everybody's hope. And I know we were probably going to talk about that. So I'll put a pin in that for later. But I think people are I think the importance of kind of honest, vetted data, to your point earlier about we might not get exact numbers, but having comfort in the methodology and how it's being evaluated and where are the biases and where are the incentive structures built. I think more companies are going to spread up that are gathering this data because, to your point, I think a lot of people want it and they want to have comfort in where it's coming from and the nuance of it.
I would love to agree with you, but what we see on the market is actually quite opposite. People don't care. It's almost like on one of the latest podcasts I did, I checked how many exchanges are in the US. I mean, top 10 exchanges. 1 out of 10. The rest was BVI, Cayman Island, and that's majority. And we hear what is Kraken or Coinbase, setting up offshore entity to process some of the trades because of the U.S. government impact. So that's.
I think I read Bittrex maybe also left the United States, right? And again, I feel like I read something on LinkedIn and I'm like, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that there are absolutely folks that are closing up tents, and this is something that the industry has been screaming about. Like if you look at a lot of the trade associations, I think Blockchain Association is actively collecting because we know it's happening. But if you can't put in front of policymakers and regulators, like here are the people, here are the businesses, to your point, here are the numbers, like hard numbers of innovators and businesses and companies that are leaving the United States because of a complete lack of regulatory clarity, because of a insanely selective enforcement environment that does not reek of fairness. It reeks of an arbitrariness that is really disconcerting. And there are many people, I'm sure you've heard of Operation Choke Point 2.0, who feel that this is not an accident. This is, the interest of traditional finance and having like an inappropriate ability to shut down an entire competitive industry. That could be its own 2-hour long podcast. But there is right now, I feel, a very real concern, especially in the United States, that you don't have a objective administration view on this technology, right? We should be able to sit and, to your point, talk about the risks, talk about the downsides, but also talk about the upsides. And a recent report that the administration put out basically just acknowledged some of the use cases and then crashed them. And that was super frustrating because there are a lot of good use cases. In fact, Rebecca Reddig at Polygon Labs just announced the other day, they are creating a use case database, which I'm incredibly excited about because people are living in a world of sound bites and we are losing nuance and we're losing objective discussion. And you have to fight. You do this all. This to me is what the beauty of podcasts like yours. We have to fight to cut through the noise of these polarizing people who just want to They want to say all crypto is bad, or they want to say crypto is all good. Both of those are wildly wrong and dangerous extreme positions, right? To me, extremism in any form is bad because it's never that clear, right? Everything is gray. Everything's a discussion. Everything's a pluses and minuses. I mean, with the exception of like some, murder, right? But even then, we have, okay, well, there's justifiable homicide and defenses. Even then, nuance matters. Context matters. And we are losing that. And I think conversations like this, podcasts like this, it's so important to have a more nuanced, objective discussion. So, yes, I think those people are out there, and I think they're a massive risk on every level, because if a regulator just listens to some guy who's trying to stay relevant and say all crypto is a Ponzi scheme, then we are toast. The answer is not to get some biased person coming in saying crypto is perfect and it's going to solve all the world's problems. But there are, I think, a lot of us out there who are objective and want to have the kind of honest broker conversations that policymakers and regulators need. And I think some trade associations are really good and are doing this around the world and here in the United States. But it is a mission critical time where now those organizations have to be at DEFCON 1. Like DEFCON 5 is not going to cut it anymore.
Yeah. And I agree with you. You mentioned something, around travel, especially in Asia. And I remember my time when I spent with UN, ODC on, providing training to the Asian region. And there's like completely different perception of the risk and completely different perception of what it brings. Crypto and Web 3.0, and I think Web 3.0 in, much bigger scale. And, right now, I'm just going to bring this up. So we have this investor advisory committee in the letter from 6th of April to to SEC. And effectively what we have here is they say that 100% or, almost all crypto tokens are security, and the platforms should be regulated in the same way, right? So investor advisory committee, and Christopher Mirabel, Leslie Van Boskier, and there's a couple of people, indicated in this letter. But I think, this direction of travel, it's crazy. I think, it's just like, what's going to happen with the lawyers who advise differently that this is not the what's the test, the name of the test?
The Howry test. The oranges, right? The case in the United States. I think what's really interesting there is, again, I go back to my blanket statements are rarely a good thing, right? Somebody coming out and saying all coins are securities, I'm very hesitant to get behind that person. In fact, I'm taking 3 large, giant steps to the right and just being like, they're over there with that opinion. Not because they're per se wrong, but just because when you think about the difference in utility tokens, when you think about the difference in the technologies of these tokens, when you think about all of the facts that could be different, right? There were a lot of tokens, and I have friends that do this work. There were a lot of tokens at the beginning that were trying to get advice, that were trying to go to lawyers. And to your point, what's going to happen to all those lawyers who, and I don't know what the end of that sentence was, but I will finish it with, gave the advice that their client wanted to hear instead of what they needed to hear? I don't know, because they have, there's rarely ever a reckoning for them, sadly, like from a professional liability standpoint. But I know, and this is part of the reason why I started the Association for Women in Crypto, I know that there were several successful, well-respected women who were in this field very early on, who were giving these folks the advice they needed to hear, many of whom might not be in the trouble that they're in now had they stuck with those lawyers instead of toddling down the street, sadly, often to a dude who would give them whatever they wanted to hear and practice and become the blockchain lawyer. And now they've painted these folks into a really problematic place because the sleeping giant that is the SEC or folks around the world who are looking at this are now like, well, as it turns out, they are in fact securities. Now, I'm not saying the SEC is always right. And in fact, recent lawsuits that have been brought against them make some really good arguments for why they might be overzealous and how they're applying the test. But I will say that the crypto industry would have been far better off if early on it had listened to the lawyers who were telling it what it needed to hear instead of what it wanted to hear. And I think we're sadly seeing the ramifications of that. And I also think it's why now, when I talk to a lot of crypto companies in the industry, they are very nervous about this new trend of lawyers hanging a shingle and being a crypto lawyer and advising on this after not having done crypto at all, knowing very little about crypto, and starting a blockchain practice with people who just woke up one day and decided to do crypto. Which, don't get me wrong, lawyers can learn, but if it were me, I would probably want somebody who's captained at least, a few voyages before I take somebody who's like, I just aced the captain's test and I'm ready to sail the world. Not necessarily who I probably want helming that ship.
No, I completely agree. But at the same time, question is whether the industry would grow if you would have this is security and you need to treat this as security. So every transaction in the token should be treated the same way. It's you transact in security with all the restrictions, all.
No, but there were companies that did. There were companies that were given that advice that did register, that did try to go through the process. So to say that this industry wouldn't exist if they weren't doing it,
it would be different. It would be different.
It would definitely be different, but I don't think it wouldn't be there, and I don't think it wouldn't be successful because there are cases of folks who did do it right? I mean, yes, Coinbase has had some problems, but from the beginning, they decided to be here in the United States. They decided to work with regulators. And in fact, I think, their GC has been out there. I'm worried about butchering his last name. I've heard Paul Greywall, but we'll just say Paul G because he is the OG. But he's been out there telling the world, look, we were trying to do this right. We met with them. We had conversations. This was not for lack of trying. And I think that's the part that feels very unfair, is that where you have companies that were trying to get this right with regulators, that were trying to have these conversations, that were not hiding the ball, that were not an HSBC, that were not the traditional financial institutions who knew what they were supposed to do and just decided to choose business over compliance. That's not what we have here. And so it feels very unfair when a regulator turns around and in what feels like a very malicious spirit, right? It's kind of like you're sitting at a table, you're negotiating, and then somebody walks away and takes that and just torches your earth. And you're like, but we were just sitting here talking. Where did that come from? And it feels very tech unneutral. It feels very attack on crypto because they were there at the table doing what we wanted the system to have it do. And I think that's part of the problem that we're having now with the entire kind of compliance regime is in the United States, you had a Bank Secrecy Act that was passed in the 70s that was largely focused on cash and how cash moved into the system and how money moved around the system and how correspondent banking, I believe, came much later. But you had a statute that was written for cash in the 70s that is now dictating what anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing should look like. And that's a problem. And part of the problem, and I have this conversation, I feel like 10 times a day, is the United States in particular has always been very reactionary. It's very difficult for it to proactively move with vision. And that's been a problem. We barely won the war for the internet. And right now, people in the United States are terrified that we are actively losing the war on digital assets and who will win the war on innovation. We have historically in the United States been the number one country for innovation. But if you do not adapt fast enough and you don't create a regulatory framework that gives companies and innovators and founders the ability to comply with some sense of certainty, they will leave the United States. And now with globalization, they can go to some seriously fantastic places, pop open a laptop and run the world. I spent 2 months in Thailand, and I will tell you, it was tough coming back. It was tough. So these companies aren't going to go tomorrow to the UK or Dubai or Singapore or whatever absolutely, lovely place to live in. If there's a regulatory framework that allows them to grow. And that is a real present threat that I feel like the industry validly has concerns that US policymakers and regulators are just blithely torching with a kind of lack of concern that is terrifying for those of us who are watching what feels like an empire like kind of like toppling and about to fall. And we can't get that back. Our generation will not be able to refight that war if we lose the war to keep innovation in digital assets in the United States. And the exodus that is happening is like not big enough. It's like, when one person leaves your house, when one person leaves a building, a couple people leave a building, it's not disconcerting. The problem with the United States is we tend not to notice anything until thousands of people are running for the exits, the door's blocked, they're dying, and now we've got people in a building. And we're trying to start a committee to figure out what caused all these people dying in a building. It's like, you did not have a door open. We told you to open the door months ago. Like, we could have avoided all these dead bodies, but you had to see the dead bodies before you unlock the door. And that's the thing that all of us are frustrated and terrified with.
Yeah, and then we have, I think, additional complexity on DeFi, right? And that's another, area where US is becoming quite active. And, the approach which, DeFi, we need to apply AML rules to the DeFi space. And this is in line with what is like, I agree with this, right? We need to have some kind of application of money laundering rules to DeFi, DEX, decentralized, world. But at the same time, should we apply old law to this new mechanism when it's something, really a code as opposed to group of people or entity behind, the decentralized exchange, which is exactly the same or very similar to the, centralized exchange. So what's your view on this? Where we are with, decentralized exchanges and, is this becoming additional risk, complexity, or is it the future of finance in general? Which I think is like, I would support strongly the last statement, which is the future.
So about 6 years ago, I was at a illicit finance conference talking with somebody who was in one of the major government regulatory agencies. And I said to him, I was like, what do you think is the single biggest risk in illicit finance, like coming like on the horizon? And he said, absolutely decentralized exchanges. Decentralized exchanges are going to be terrifying. And I'm focusing on decentralized exchanges, right? Not necessarily DeFi as a whole, because not everything in DeFi obviously is exchanges. But the entire industry has been kind of touting the ability of on and off ramps, right? Especially in CeFi, obviously. That these on and off ramps, these are the places where the ability to do AML, CFT, right? This is where it's so critical.
Yeah.
The fact that you and I can have unhosted wallets and transfer money amongst ourselves, like the industry has kind of been like, these are not the droids you're looking for, right? And they've kind of like put that to the side and said like, oh, you don't have to worry about that, right? Like if one money launderer transfers money to another money launderer, like, it's unhosted wallets. And I'm going to put that aside because that is a whole other bucket of worms, right? That we could pry open and talk about. But this emphasis on off ramps is really problematic. No, was valid, right? 100% baseline. If you're in an exchange, you absolutely needed to have these things, right? And I think countries came out. Maybe we would have liked it a little bit faster, but they came out, and most countries that are FATF compliant have, rules for VASPs or exchanges that deal in CBCs or whatever terminology you're using it. But the on and off ramps, it's pretty recognized. Like, okay, you need this. With DeFi, the problem is that you had a bunch of people who were treating the creation of financial services like widgets. Like they were inventing something that was not the transfer of funds cross-border globally instantly for pennies on the dollar with little to no supervision or any kind of controls, right? And I remember talking with an attorney in this space who was quite surprised, like the way that I put, because he asked me, did I think that DeFi needed, AML, KYC, all these things? And I said, my response was, I don't know that it necessarily looks like what it looks like in a traditional bank, because technologically, and at the time, I don't know that I even knew what oracles were, but basically what I was saying was like, technologically, you guys do amazing things. You could build in the pillars of AML and CFT without it necessarily looking exactly like, right, what it looks like in traditional finance. And there's some identity issues there, and there's discussion there, but when we talk about responsible innovation, to me, that was the conversation to have was, hey, we're building this decentralized financial services. What would our version of AML CFT look like?
Yeah.
And let's at least try to have something that looks like we tried to address this. And the problem was some of these companies they just opened Pandora's box, like ripped it open, put it out there. And I said to them, if I was the inventor of a DeFi service that later ended up being the financing source or capability for the next 9/11, and I was sitting at a table in front of 12 jurors justifying my actions by saying, well, all I did was put the software out there that enabled them to finance this. I didn't run it, and I certainly didn't give them the money. I literally just created the software framework for them to be able to do this without any AML or CFT being able to be done. If I was still a prosecutor, I would choose being at the other table every day and twice on Sunday. And I was like, you just have to decide which table you want to be sitting at there. And the faces, like sometimes people's faces, you're just like, because I thought it's a premise we could agree that financing terrorism is bad. Money laundering is bad. We should be trying to avoid this in financial services. But I feel like some people in the DeFi invention arena either A, weren't having those conversations, or worse, B, weren't even thinking about it when they created this thing and unleashed it into the world. And now it's out there. And you can't shove it back in Pandora's. So now we're trying to go back and kind of make sure Pandora doesn't run around slaughtering the world with terrorist financing and money laundering. So yeah, I have mixed feelings about DeFi, because I think some of them, and I know there are some companies out there who are very much running around like that robot sweeping up after the person who breaks up all the glass, like, we can fix this, and you're like, I really hope you can. I hope you can build into this industry something. And again, I think a lot of us would agree it does not necessarily have to it maybe shouldn't have to comply with the 1970s version of it. But I guarantee you that if these folks had been building in something that resembled AML and CFT, see when I say that their conversations with regulators would be so much more productive we tried to do this right. Here's a version of BSA modernization that you should consider. Boy, howdy, would that conversation have gone so differently in the last 5 years than the whole don't regulate us, this is different, justifying basically what feels like in some ways and in some spaces, wildly irresponsible innovation.
100%. I totally agree. And funny, because obviously, in GateNox, this is the part which we want to address, right? Identity, especially corporate identity. And the discussion with DeFi, they understand, and frankly, they say, oh, we are not regulated, it do not apply to us, but they know that actually it's quite opposite. They just simply run it with eyes closed. And that's something which is really scary, because what you said is completely true. That if there will be terrorist financing or human trafficking financing, or war financing through DeFi, how these guys could say, "Oh, we didn't care," we just the code,
we just put it out there. Yeah, we just put the code out there. We just, it's just a mixer, it's just a tumbler, it's just whatever. We just put it. We all we did was put that AR-15 on the ground and left it. Who picks that up and decides? And don't get me wrong, and that's a terrible example, actually, because guns are not really tech neutral, right? Theoretically, I know that these folks would make the argument that there were positive things, right? It was about privacy. And I get that. I do. And I'm not saying privacy is not important. But I think what you're seeing now, and you just started to allude to it, is the recognition that more pieces were needed, right? Digital identity and, zero knowledge proofs and what we need in order, like I think there's a picture here that a lot of folks can see. And DeFi is a puzzle piece, digital identity is a puzzle piece, and all of these pieces will be assembled into what is essentially the successful picture of the future of digital assets. This is what everybody's fighting for.
100%.
People are like, well, what do you mean when you say the future of digital assets? I'm like, it's not what exists now.
Yeah.
Some of these haven't been solved. But what these companies are doing and why you want it in the United States and not abroad is because when the digital identity piece is figured out, when zero knowledge proofs and the ability to not have these giant honeypots of connecting transactional data with identity data, when we are able to kind of fix these pieces and assemble them together into what will effectively be the future of digital finance and what fund transfers will look like in the future, that will literally be the next internet. We are building it and we're trying to figure it out. And what people don't understand is if you squashed little pieces of the internet as it was being built, you would not have the internet, and you certainly wouldn't have it in the United States. And people don't get, like, yes, there are absolutely some people who are doing this wrong, and we need to call out those bad actors. But there are absolutely some people who are trying to do this right. And we need to take those good actors, recognize what they're doing, recognize the importance of it staying in the United States and figuring out this puzzle here. And if we don't do that, we will kill it. And to a point that you made earlier that is incredibly frustrating to me was when you said like these DeFi protocols that say we're not regulated, we don't have to do this.
Yeah.
I think for some of them, it's clear that what they're doing is money services. And maybe they don't qualify as like a money transmitter or a money service. Like they're figuring out ways to kind of like weave through loopholes, right? So that they can make the argument that, oh, we're so decentralized, we don't have control, like, right? And they're just trying to figure out a way to get out of their responsibility instead of trying to build in a way to say, what's the way that we would feel comfortable sitting at that table and saying, we did everything that we could, right? It's like, this is in the law, right? This is where I'm going to geek out a little bit. Negligence versus we tried and failed, right? Yeah. And optics matter to a jury, right? When you have an actor that comes in who tried their best and failed, whether it was technologically unfeasible, whatever the reason was, intent matters. Context matters. So when you come in and your attitude is, we didn't think we needed to try. That's not our responsibility. We just unleashed this into the world and did not even try to keep out money laundering or terrorist financing. That's somebody else's problem. All we did was put the software out there. Let me tell you, boy, 12 people in any country, but especially the United States post 9/11 are not going to respond well to that. They're not. They're just not. And so I think that's a part of the problem. I mean, even HSBC is sitting there saying, I mean, we tried to have an AML program. We did our very best. We just couldn't help but those cartel members coming in and just, it's like, that's the part of the industry that I'm like, don't do that. Like, this is the time where you need to mature, kind of fluff off your kind of cypherpunk libertarian origins and realize that the adults in the room need you to grow up. For this industry to succeed, we need you to grow up. And that maturation process is happening for some of the industry. But boy, those ones that are running around breaking stuff and saying like, let's keep moving fast and breaking things, we are at the point where it is too expensive to break things. So now there's a little like discipline process where it's like, no, we need you guys to grow up. And a lot of these companies, you've got the same guys, and it's a lot of guys running these companies where there's a little bit of a what got you here will not get you there. And some of the best companies, the CEOs like looked around and said, this is not what I do well. And they stepped aside. They did other things, like their CTOs, their COOs, there are other things. But I think there's a lot of folks in the industry who would love if a lot of, just not all of it, but pieces of the industry would kind of either have their leadership move into the maturation phase and change the conversation and evolve the conversation to be more productive with regulators, or just frankly get out of the way and let somebody do it who will?
Yeah. And that's very interesting. Why this type of message is not getting across to crypto world, and I think by the same token to the regulators, right? So why these two parties are talking but not listening and do not try to understand the underlying problem. But Amanda, okay, let's pause it here, right? Yeah. Listen, this is lovely, so thank you very much for this.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a great discussion.
Crypto Compliance, brought to you by Gate Knox.